Uh, Good afternoon, my colleagues. I'm from Rote Island in East Nusa Tenggara, Indonesia. It's exactly 5 p.m. here. Hopefully, all friends who attended online for this event are healthy, enthusiastic to take part in this international sharing forum on gender and human rights, Series 8, with the theme Election and Human Rights for Democracy. On this Saturday, 8 June 2024. I'm Nukila Evanty. I'm your moderator for this event. I would like to say the importance of human rights to election and electoral processes is more critical than ever. Indonesia has just passed a presidential election, and we have our new president now. So I would like to mention that there is an interlinkage between human rights and democracy, interconnected with the in promoting, protecting human rights, the right to take part in the conduct of public affairs, including the right to vote, the right to participation, is the core of democratic governance based on the will of the people. So we have the resource person who are expert in this field. I would like to mention Dr. Stephen Sherlock, Dr. Sri Nuryanti, Dr. Rina Shahrullah, Dr. Pankaj Choudhury. I'm sorry if I misspell your names incorrectly. Dr. Manashi Kalita, Dr. MD Zahidul Islam. So before the event, I would like to invite the head of the ASEAN Studies Center, Universitas International Batam, Miss Ninne Zahara, to convey the message, opening speech. Sorry, please.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Nukila Evanty, for your presence today. Okay, I would like to greetings all the speakers, to the Honorable Dr. Sherlock, and also to Honorable Dr. Pankaj Choudhury, and also Professor Zahidul Islam, and also Dr. Sri Nuryanti that become our speakers today in this webinar. It is a fact that in several months ago, Indonesia just passed the presidential election and also legislative election. Yeah, it left us quite some problems actually, because there's a lot of conflicts and also some issues regarding political matters. So it would be very helpful in this discussion. We could talk more about the election and gender. Yeah, and we see that we don't have any woman in the presidential election this year. So maybe I will give back to the moderator and hope the discussion will go on smoothly, and also giving a lot more insight and enlightenment regarding gender and election issues in human rights. Thank you, Ms. Nukila. Back to you.
Thank you, Miss Ninne Zahara Silviani, from the head of the ASEAN Studies Center, Universitas International Batam, Indonesia. So this is the moment. I would like to invite first for our speaker, Dr. Stephen Sherlock. Please, I give you the time, Dr. Sherlock, please. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Ibu, for that kind introduction. I'm very pleased to be able to take part in this webinar with a variety of speakers, both women and men, and to try to add a little to this discussion from the perspective of Australia, which is what I was asked to do. I wouldn't talk about Australia as if it's some sort of model, but since I was asked to speak about Australia, I'll try to, in this very short time that's available, touch on some of the very enormous themes about human rights, democracy, and gender, try to draw some sort of interconnection amongst them by using the example of, first of all, the recent Australian election, but also touch on it just very briefly on a couple of the features of the Australian political system. The Australian am I still okay? There's a few interruptions going on. I'm not quite sure if it's all still running fine. Anyway, so I'll try to draw some connections between human rights and elections. I'm using the examples of just a couple of features of the Australian electoral system. I don't have time to talk anything like comprehensively, but a couple of things which I think might be of interest, which are unusual about the Australian electoral system. So I've entitled my presentations Elections and Human Rights for Democracy, the legislative practice in Australia. So first of all, just let me, as I was asked to do, talk a little bit about the recent Australian election, now 18 months ago, but it still seems quite fresh in one's memory. This was an election on the 21st of May last year, an election for the lower house of Parliament, the House of Representatives, and for half of the members of our upper house, the Senate. Now, Australia has, just by brief introduction to people who may not know, Australia has a parliamentary system as distinct from a presidential system like Indonesia's, with government formed by a party or coalitions of parties with a majority in the lower house, majority in the House of Representatives, and a 3-year term of office. The House of Representatives is made up of 151 members, and each of those members, those representatives, are elected from a single member district. So unlike Indonesia's proportional representation system, we have a single member system, what would in Indonesia be called a district system, such as in India, or as the system that Australia is modelled on from the United Kingdom. But the big difference about the Australian system, and this is a feature of our system I would be keen to talk more about, but I don't really have time, is that unlike in UK, we do not have a first past the post system. In other words, to be elected in your particular district, it's not enough just to get a plurality of votes. You cannot be elected just with 40% or 49% of the vote. To be elected, a candidate must achieve 51%. And the way in which it's possible to achieve 51% at least in every electorate and in every district is through this system of a preferential vote. Political scientists call it generally an alternative vote system. In Australia, we usually refer to it as the preferential system. A system where a voter not only marks his or her favoured candidate, but has to show his or her preference of candidates. So marking 1 against a box for the candidate that he or she prefers, number 2 for their second preference, number 3, and so forth. And through a system of counting, which I don't have time to describe, that will always end up with 2 candidates. The final candidate, by definition, one of those must have a majority. This is a system that, linking this to human rights, it has the particular advantage of giving some influence to minor parties. So small parties may not be able to be elected, but they have influence in the system by being able to invite or encourage their voters to give their second preference to one of the major parties. And that can influence the decisions and the political positions of the major parties. The Senate is of 76 members, elected through a proportional representation system, such as is the case in the DPR, the Parliament of Indonesia, with 12 senators per state and 2 per territory, also by preferential vote. Now, the result of the election was an overturning of 8 years of Conservative Party rule. The Conservative Party in Australia is called the Liberal Party, to the confusion of people from the United States, for example. But the Liberal Party, in coalition with the National Party, had been in power for about 8 years. They were removed from office in this election, and the Australian Labor Party won the election. but only narrowly, achieving 78 seats in the House of Representatives, quite narrow majority. Majority is 76, they have 78. They defeated the Liberal and National Coalition. And now Prime Minister Albanese, Deputy Prime Minister Richard Marles, both of whom are from the House of Representatives. But then you note that also ministers can also come from the upper house, from the Senate. And a very senior member of the government, the Foreign Minister, Penny Wong, is a member of the Senate. And she is also the Senate leader of the government forces in the Senate. Now, here's a pictorial representation of the balance of forces in the House of Representatives following the election. And you'll see there the government formed by the Australian Labor Party with 78 members. The main opposition party, the Conservatives, the Liberal and National Party coalition, but also you'll see there 12 independents, which is very unusual. It's very, very unusual in a system where you have one representative per district for non-party candidates. This is one of the interesting developments that's occurring in Australia today. The number of people who are turning away from the major parties. That in the 1950s, 60s, into the 70s, about 95% of people would vote for one of the two major parties, either the Labor Party or one of the Conservative coalition parties. Now, about 65% of people are voting for the major parties. More and more people are voting for independents or for some of these minor parties. And it will be interesting to see whether or not this trend continues. The effect of it is to make it quite difficult, potentially quite difficult, for majority governments to be formed. As you see, the Labor Party there only has a very narrow majority, even though they got about 52.5% of the total vote, which would in all normal circumstances in the past been seen as almost a landslide. They only just achieved a majority. Moving on then to the upper house, the Senate. Now, there you will see an interesting feature, which is a product of the different electoral system. There, the government, even though it has a majority in the House of Representatives and therefore has formed a government, the Labor Party has formed a government, it only has 26 senators, whereas the opposition parties have 31 senators. But that is not necessarily always a problem for the government, because if you look down there at the minor parties, you'll see that the proportional representation system provides many more opportunities for smaller parties, most notably the Australian Greens, who receive about 10% of the vote. And generally speaking, the Greens party will support most legislation which is put up by the Labor Party. So with the support of the Greens, the Labor Party is able to have its legislation passed, but it does mean, therefore, that the Greens, as a minor party, are able to exercise their voice in democracy. And this is I think, an important point about human rights and democracy, about the rights of people from supporting minority parties and from minority points of view within the community, who are able to be represented in the Australian upper house. But because government is not formed in the upper house, this does not lead to instability of government, because one of the criticisms of proportional representation systems is that it does lead to unstable government and formation of unstable coalitions. But that's not an issue in the Senate, because government is not formed in the Senate. But nevertheless, it does give the right of minor parties and the people who support minority voices to have their voice heard in Parliament. Now, let's quickly then look at important issue for this webinar, the issue of gender. And I'd like to just give you a quick picture of the gender-based representation in the Australian Parliament. In the House of Representatives, there are 39% women. which by world standards is quite good. It's not outstanding, but it is relatively good. In the Senate, on the other hand, you will see here there are a majority of women. Again, this is characteristic of proportional representation systems, that they do tend to open up more opportunities for candidates. So 57% are women against 43% men. So the total number of representation of women in the Australian Parliament is 45% for women, which, if you look at that figure, is quite a good level of representation in international terms. Not quite as good as some Scandinavian countries, excuse me, but not insignificant. What becomes interesting, though, is that if you look at the representation of women by party, and here there is a very interesting story to be told, because in the Labor Party, a majority of the Labor Party's representatives in the Senate and House of Representatives combined are women. 53% of Labor representatives in the Senate and the House are female. And the Greens have the same number. The Conservative parties, however, are far behind when it comes to women's representation. And only 29% of their members of the House of Representatives and the Senate are women. Now, there's just two quick points I would like to make about this, and that is that the issue of women's representation in the Conservative parties has actually become an issue overall, and a point of criticism from many quarters, including by many women, of course, of the low level of women's representation in the Conservative parties. And in fact, that large number of independent members in the House of Representatives that I pointed out, an unusually large number of independent members, most of those, not all of them, but most of those are actually women. And they are women who either used to be members of one of the Conservative parties or were associated with it, but became disgruntled with the treatment of women within that party. So, in fact, this group of independent candidates could, in fact, be seen as a split faction from the Conservative Party. And as I said, most of them are women. And one of the issues that motivated them to stand for election in opposition to their traditional, the parties that they are traditionally associated with, was because of the lack of representation of women in their political parties. But the second point I wanted to make about that is this is an example of the power of quotas, not legislative quotas like there are in Indonesia, but voluntary party-based internal quotas. Because since the 1990s, the Australian Labor Party has had a quota for a target of 35%, or is it 30 or 35% representation of women in winnable seats. That is, it's not possible to just push women away to seats where it's unlikely to win, but 35% of them are required to be women. And the Labor Party now far exceeds this quota. But that quota has been in operation now for 30 years, and over time it has gradually built up women's representation within the party, whereas the Conservative parties do not have a quota like that. In fact, they argue against it, and the results are there clearly to be seen. All right, now quickly on the second half of my presentation, focusing on the issue of fair representation as human rights, and two particular features of the Australian electoral system, which I think relate quite closely to this issue. And I'm not presenting them as models that the rest of the world follows, but generally make the point that this is how things have happened in Australia and what have been the effects. Because Australia has a history of innovation in electoral processes. And in fact, secret ballot with candidates printed on the ballot was first introduced into Australia in 1856. It was the first place in the world where this system of secret ballots and people voting on ballots that had the names of the candidates printed on it has actually been called for a long time in political science literature the Australian ballot. And there's a long history of innovation in electoral systems, and there's at least two features of the Australian electoral system that contribute to fairness and participation and fairness in representation, two basic democratic rights and therefore basic human rights. First of all, of those I want to talk about is compulsory voting, that it is compulsory for everybody to vote. And the second point is that the drawing up of district boundaries is conducted by an independent commission. It is not in the hands of the politicians as it is, for example, in the United States. So let's then talk about that. The legal framework for Australian elections is all within the Commonwealth Electoral Act of 1918, been amended many times since then, of course. Don't get confused by the word Commonwealth. It doesn't mean the British Commonwealth. It's just that the official name of Australia is the Commonwealth of Australia. So any federal legislation has that word Commonwealth in front of it. Now, the Act is what would in Indonesia be termed an omnibus system, not because it brought together a whole range of other different legislation, but from the very beginning, the intention was that all aspects of the electoral system would be contained within this piece of legislation. So the Electoral Act sets out the authority of the Australian Electoral Commission, the AEC, the management of the electoral rolls and the election of both houses. The system for compulsory voting is described there, the requirements for political parties and their registration, electoral funding and expenditure, how campaigning is meant to be conducted. There's a system for resolving disputes between candidates after elections. And that Act also describes the power of the AEC in drawing up district boundaries. Many of those features, as many of our speakers would be aware, are contained in a number of different acts in Indonesia and may be in other countries as well. But in Australia, we have this omnibus law. All right, now let's talk a little bit about compulsory voting, and the picture there I'll explain that as we go along. So under Section 254.1 of the Electoral Act, it states that it shall be the duty, that's my emphasis, the duty of every elector to vote at each election. So the principle, the philosophy behind this is that not only is it a right of people to vote, but it is their duty to vote. It's one of their civic duties. It's one of their duties as citizens. And the Act sets out provisions for penalties and potentially for fines. I don't have time to go into the details of that. But that system has been in operation in Australia since 1924. So what it has done now is it has permeated into the Australian political culture. So it has created a culture of participation by voters. So it's 90% plus turnout of votes, sometimes as high as 95%. Why it's not 100%, I don't really have time to explain. And one of the little interesting things that has grown up around this is what has now been started to be called the democracy sausage. And that is that when people go along to vote, there's a festival atmosphere. Suharto, of course, in Indonesia used to talk about the pesta democracy, but basically it was a fraud. Whereas in Australia, Election Day does really have a genuine atmosphere of a festival. And most of the polling places are schools. And schools take this opportunity to use Election Day as a way to just raise some money for their school. And a favourite way to do that in Australia is to have what's called a sausage sizzle. That is just people cook up sausages and sell them in a bun. And that's been going on now for so many elections. The people expect, they go along to their local school to vote, they expect they'll be able to buy a sausage and contribute to their local school while also voting. And this is just a little feature that is an illustration of the fact that a culture of participation has grown up around compulsory voting. I'm not saying it would work in every single country, but it works in Australia. And at a more serious level, this has been analysed by a number of political scientists, this system of compulsory voting, as providing an incentive to participation and an incentive to campaign, most importantly, not only an incentive for voters, but also an incentive for campaigners, for parties, for candidates to campaign to the political centre. Because you have to appeal to everybody in the community, that encourages people, that encourages, disencourages extremist parties on the fringes of politics and encourages candidates and parties to campaign to the political centre. There we go. So there are a range of both normative and practical arguments in the debate about compulsory voting.
Sherlock, you have 5 minutes more.
5 minutes more. Okay, that's great. I thought I didn't have that much time, so I'm very pleased to hear that. Okay, so because in times of increasing polarisation across politics globally, a strong argument in favour of compulsory voting is that it creates incentives for campaigners to appeal to the political centre, because it's not possible to consistently win with the support of a minority of the population. If we take, for example, the case of the United States, where even in presidential elections, it's very often the case that only something like half the population is actually voting. And that turnout is not random. It has historically been the same 50 or 60% of the population who have been voting, which means that it's possible to be elected as president or elected as a congressperson appealing to only about 25 or 30% of the vote. And it's the same 25, 30% of the vote, educated middle class especially, and that has arguably encouraged and contributed to the breakdown of political in the United States and the turn towards extremist politics in the United States. And of course, the United States is just an example. This is something which, unfortunately, we know is happening across the world. And a very recent and important study by that on this issue, looking at a range of different countries that do use a system of compulsory voting, the authors concluded that by reducing more extreme voters' ability to threaten to abstain and by alienation, the introduction of compulsory voting can push party platforms towards the median voters' preferences. Now, the second feature of the Australian political system, which is not so unusual, but it's very important to emphasise this because I think it's a key to encouraging not only participation, but also fairness. In other words, that everybody's vote should have the same effect. That if you vote in one district, your vote should have the same capacity to vote to elect a member of the chamber as a voter in another district. And also that the boundaries of districts should conform to real social and geographic boundaries and not be gerrymandered, as once again is the case in the United States, where state legislatures, where the politicians have the power to draw boundaries and where some extraordinary shaped electorates districts have been drawn up, some of them not even contiguous, with one lot of population here and one population here, not even connected. And all of that has happened because the districting, the drawing up of boundaries is in the hand of politicians, whereas in Australia, and as I said, Australia's not alone here, but I think it's important to mention this, that having this power within the hands of the Independent Electoral Commission has produced a far fairer system than in many countries where the politicians have some influence or have even complete control over their system. This was not the case in Australia up until about the 1980s. And part of the reason why it was changed by the very people who you might think benefited from it, that is, by the politicians, part of the reason why it was changed was because they realised that the politicisation of electoral boundaries created constant disputes. It made it difficult often for results to be made quickly and clearly, and it became a huge something that had consumed a huge amount of political time and energy. So the politicians themselves saw the advantage of taking this power of making boundaries and districting out of their hands and putting it into an independent electoral management body. And it's now conducted by what's called a redistribution committee. It's a committee which has the power to set boundaries. And that is made up of the electoral commissioners, that is the head of the AEC at the federal level and at the state level, and also by the surveyor general, that is the people who are responsible for setting out where population lies in particular parts of the country. So in other words, it's technocrats who run this. It's not the politicians. But also what's important is that the timing and the management of any redistribution is set down in the Act of Parliament. That the Redistribution Committee has a set of guidelines that it has to follow, legislative guidelines, which are set down in the Act. So a redistribution must occur in every district at least every 7 years, or it can occur if there are significant changes in population. And in practice, in most districts, redistributions, as they're called, happen more often than every 7 years. And most importantly, the politicians cannot decide the timing. Not only is the actual task in the hands of the AEC and the Redistribution Committee, but the timing of a redistribution is in their hands as well. But it's also open to public input, and public here includes political parties. So the Redistribution Committee will publish their proposal for boundaries, and members of the public then have the opportunity to comment on that, to criticise that, to argue against it. And very often this input is taken into account by the Redistribution Committee. But, and this is the final point, that although this initial decision is open to appeal from political parties, and political parties often do appeal against these decisions, ultimately the final decision is in the hands of the Redistribution Committee. And all of this relates to this issue of human rights, which is underlying the theme of this webinar. That not only is it a human right to vote, it's also regarded in Australia as a citizen's duty, but also we have a system designed to ensure that there is fairness both in being able to vote, that is, everybody is required to vote, so that there's no chance, for example, of people being subtly or unsubtly excluded from the vote. That human right, the denial of that human right is excluded, but also that the human right to have an equal voice in Parliament, not just to have a voice through your vote, but that your vote should count equally with all other voters. So I'll leave that as the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Sherlock. It was very interesting to hear about how diverse is Australian political parties, particularly with in regard with their position. For instance, Australian Labor Party in the government, Liberal Party in the opposition. There is also minor parties. I really like to hear about that more. Independent parties, and also it's very interesting also as well when you mention about the parliament increased by gender. For instance, the House, the Senate, like a Labour Party, Green Party, except the coalition, yeah. And it's very interesting also, I would like to highlight about the Omnibus Law that covers all electoral system in Australia. Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Sherlock. for your presentation. Now, Associate Professor Dr. MD Zahidul Islam is the head of Department of Law, Bangladesh University. The time is yours.
Actually, I'm very honored to be member here today with all of the renowned professors and others. I will talk about election and human rights for democracy in Bangladesh. I will discuss on Bangladesh perspective. If we talk about the democracy, the well-known definition, if we see that democracy is the government of the people, by the people, of the people. Democracy is the government of the people, by the people, for the people. Abraham Lincoln. So democracy is for the people and by the people. So if we see the situation like Bangladesh, developing countries, see their democracy. So sometimes people feel that, okay, their democracy means by the people. That means the election only. Okay, democracy is not only the election. Democracy is a lot of things. Democracy, if your election commission is not independent, if your organ of the government is not independent, then there is no democracy. There is no meaning of democracy. Democracy is not only the election. If we see the current scenario of Bangladesh, the government, the election commission organized 12 national elections in Bangladesh after independence 1970. All the elections except 91 and 96, these two is not very debatable, but others, all the election, always the opposition claimed it was not free and fair election. That means free and fair, that means the people was failed to give their vote independently or without any fear, without any interference. Okay, they failed to express their support freely. So it was not free and fair. The opposition always claimed. So if the opposition always claim, if it is one person failed to give their support freely, that means it is not free and fair. So this type of election organizing by the election commission, mostly in developing countries like Bangladesh. If I talk about the last election of Bangladesh, the United States State Department declared that it was not free and fair election. Okay. So when the election come, the election commission tried to organize the election, so our opposition and other political party try to make it free and fair. And to do this, they organize they try to convince the government to do free and fair election. So in this situation, to do this, okay, the different type of mechanism used in Bangladesh. Sometimes election under interim government, election under caretaker government. So then these two is very familiar right now. 1991 and 1996, the election was under the caretaker government. Because of that, these two election was less debatable. But now the present government, they demolished that provision and introduced the election against the interim government. So the other political parties, they refused, mostly the big, the biggest political party, biggest opposition party, they refused to attend the election. Last three elections they refused, and because of that, easily the present government was ruined, and they are ruling the country since 2009. So we saw the situation. If we observe, we see the different type of violence, different type of violence committed pre-elections, before the election, at the time of the election, and after the election. Pre-election violence, if we see the threat, forcing, disruption of campaign rallies, assassination, etc. And election time violence, looting, shooting, kidnapping, physical attacking, killing, etc. And post-election violence, assassination, kidnapping, rape, murder, lot of offense they are committed during this election, before, at the time of election, or after the election. The most, how we mention, the most familiar or most read news was that after our last election, one girl and one woman was raped, gang raped by the ruling party because she gave her vote to the opposition. So, if we see all this violation, all this violence, it is not committing among the political member only. Sometimes the sufferings, the people, normal general people who is not interested about election, who is not involved with the political parties, this type of general people, innocent people, also suffering during this violence. So when sometimes we saw the burning the bus, burning the house. Okay, so when you are burning the house, when you are burning the bus, killing the people. Okay, so where is their human rights? As a people, we have right to live, we have right to movement, we have right to freedom of speech, freedom of expression. Nothing. So even we saw during the election, okay, sometimes to stop or to control the opposition, the government shut down the internet, shut down the Facebook, Twitter, all the social media. So it is happening as usual with other countries. If I say last election, it was happening in Pakistan also. That claim the newspaper claimed that the internet was shut down, and to control the opposition, government take lot of state, many states to control the opposition. So election and mm, human rights is very related to the democracy, because as I saw, democracy is the government by the people, of the people, for or for the people. So if we see the government when they elected, I assume that okay, if this government elected free and fair election, the people give their support without any fear. Okay, election government formed. So when the government came to the power, are they working for the people? If we ask this question to the government, or if we see the situation of the government, then we see no, it is not working for the people actually. They are working for their people. If we see um, the GDP might be increased little bit. They are showing okay, we are working for the people. If the GDP is increased, is it working the people only? So if we see the parliament, member of the parliament, the political leaders, they are earning a lot of money, million dollar when the government come to the power. They earn million dollar. Their children going to the overseas. If you see the parliament member, or most of them sending their children to the overseas to do study. Most of the parliament member, most of the political leader, if they feel sick, they are going to overseas to the treatment. So they are not so they can go overseas anytime. They can send their children overseas to do study. So why they will improve the medical system in this country? Why they will improve the education system in this country? They are not concerned about that. So education, health is not secured for the general people. So where is human rights? So sometimes if we see that this type of countries like Bangladesh and some developing countries, I feel personally that the democracy is not suitable for this country. Democracy is not only for the election. So if it is only for election, so it's okay, but it is not for the election. So if you want to introduce good democracy, you have to ensure that your election commission is free and fair, your organ of the government independent, people can exercise their right freely, people can exercise their vote freely. So all this mechanism is related with the democracy. So what I feel when we got independent, or some countries got independent, the Western people, they come, okay, you are independent now, you just practice democracy. Democracy is very good for the country. Okay, our leaders or some leaders, they feel that, okay, yeah, it's very good. Okay, they adopted democracy. They have democracy. They feel it is democracy means the election. They organize the election only, but they fail to organize, or they fail to establish the government whose government is working for the people, of the people, or by the people. This all these things, I think most of the time the government fail to do. In Bangladesh, we have, if I see, this is the some pictures of the violence during the election or before and after election. Okay. Yeah. So in the parliament, in our parliament, we have 350 seats, and 300 people they elected from the people, the direct election, and 50 seats are reserved for the women. Okay, according to the seats of the political parties, these 50 seats allocated among the women to ensure the women empowerment. Okay, so to establish a good democratic country, we have to establish a good governance, or a government who are really care the citizen. So now sometimes we feel our most of the last three election, there was a lot of allegation that it was not free and fair election, and less than 50% people went for the vote. According to the government, they mentioned that 48% people went for the vote. Some NGOs they mentioned 42%. Some mentioned 41%. So it's not more than 50%. So even 50% people they didn't go for the vote. So the government is now on the position who doesn't have the support for more than 50%. So now the question is, now we can say this government is a democratic government. I don't know. Okay, so um, uh, so the government, because of that, the government failed to stop the corruption. Even recently, I am the United States give sanction against our former military chief, and the government, the United States also give the sanction against Rapid Action Battalion, which is the RAB, the law enforcement agencies, that they violate the human rights. So they give the sanction against the one law enforcement agencies. So in this situation, I feel we should try to establish the good governments, and if we want to establish a democratic government, democracy, we have to ensure the separation of power, independence of judiciary, independence of legislation, executive, and free and fair election. It's not only an election. So I hope this is all for me for my short presentation. If you want to know more about my country or anything else, please don't hesitate to ask me any question. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Zahidul. The next presenters are, we have two uh, speakers. One is Dr. Pankaj Choudhury and Dr. Manashi Kalita from NEF Law College India. The time is yours.
So, the topic for the day, which I have chosen for today, is election and human rights for democracy. And since my previous speaker has spoken a lot on these lines, so I would be continuing forward the idea, the notion, which is, but from the Indian perspective. Uh, so, uh, the objective for my today's speech is I have the objectives for which I am going to speak is the one is to examine the democratic rights of the people of India. The second is to analyze the future of democracy from the global perspective. Then I'll be talking about to examine the electoral process in India, as my previous speaker has spoken about the electoral process in Bangladesh. Okay. And the next point which I'll be highlighting is to find the corruption in the Indian democracy. then to examine the communal and ethnic violence which has become part and parcel in the recent phenomena in the elections, and then to examine the right to information and its achievements. Now, when I talk about, I'll start off my introduction round. When I talk about the elections and human rights and democracy, when you speak about the human rights is something, a right which is being uh, associated with the human being right from his birth. I think everybody would agree with that. It's something which is not posted upon. It's right. He is the claimant right from his birth, and Universal Declaration of Human Rights in by the institutionalized kind of human rights was through the General Assembly of United Nations. Now, another notion which I would like to bring is during 19th century, the democracy and capitalism were moving side by side or independently, but they had the parallel paths. They were working together, and somewhere their parallel journey, the concept of welfare state emerged in this notion, and it defines the role of state in an intervention manner about this. And then from here I would like to take you on to my Indian constitution, which is a right based constitution, of one of the largest constitution of the world, and it has in its foundations of human rights right from its preamble. The preamble itself talk about the human rights, and the expression is also found in part 3 and 4 of the constitution, and it also talks about the individual rights irrespective of their caste, creed, religion, sex, and nationality. So this is the brief introduction of the Indian human rights perspective. Now, when I talk about the democratic process and electoral system, Indian democracy ensures the establishment when after the British, when it talks about the sovereign, socialist, secular, and democratic republic in the country. And Indian constitution provides the ethical foundation of human rights in its preamble, and its expression is also found in the part 3 and 4 of the constitution, which is in the directive principles of the state and policy. Now, to strengthen these, we have certain uh, provisions in the Constitution. Article 326, which provides that every adult above 18 years of age can vote and he has right to vote. Now, the main idea of bringing Article 326 was that there should be a participative democracy where, irrespective of rich or poor, irrespective of your caste, creed, and religion, you can vote. So this was one of the idea. Then Article 324 talks about the superintendence, the direction, and control of electoral rolls. So there is a provision of checks and balances enshrined in our constitution, and uh, election commission of India derives its rights from these articles. Then article 243k and 243za talks about the election in panchayat and municipalities. Now when I talk about these articles, this again is forwarding the participative democracy, and it involves the rural areas and the urban areas. So I would not be hesitating to say that India lives in villages. When the democracy was uh, given to India at that time, and when we went in for democratic form of governments, the rural areas need to have a say in the election of the government. So these two articles were also included. Now, I will now move on to the problem areas, that what is actually the thing which is hampering the democracy. Democracy itself is a very beautiful thing. As my previous speaker has talked about, the democracy is for the people, by the people, and this has to make the system work. The system has to be made work. But what is the thing which proves as roadblocks for the working of the democracy? The one is increasing cost of campaigning. The political parties are being a trap, fall in the trap of the election campaignings, because from here the notion of the muscle power and money power develops. Then is first past post majoritarian, which my the first speaker was talking about, that in India the democracy process is all about who uh, has the highest number of votes. It's like in the total number of population, who got the highest. He may or he may not have the voting percentage in his favor, but since he has reached the finishing line first, so he has the first past post majoritarian kind of right. Then anti-defection, which is another is notion which breaks the democracy, is breaking the parties from inside, like split wide open between the parties by using the muscle power and money power. Basically, money power through the use of money. Then impersonation, when the voting is going on, generally in the rural areas, still in India, the rural villagers who are illiterate, they don't know about their rights, and they become the trap of impersonation. Then counting of the votes, where manipulation can be done, which is one of the phenomena which is being tried to remove. And then delimitation of the constitution. My previous speaker, number one, was talking about, is from time to time, when the population grows, to involve every section of the society, irrespective of his caste, creed, and all, in the participative democracy. The limitations, the constitution limit of the political parties should be redesigned. The voting area for a representative has to be defined from time to time. And then another issue is the hung parliament, which happens because of it has direct relation to uh, the uh, the uh, the parties when are split wide open because of use of money power. Now, to reform these, there has been various committees which have given their opinions. Like in Goswami committee in 1990 talked about the electoral reforms. Then there was a Gupta committee which talked in 1998, which we talked about the state funding, that the political parties for their campaigning should use the state funded machinery rather than their own money, which can lead to a trap of manipulations. Then electoral reforms of 1999 talks about the voter ID and electronic voting measures, electronic voting machines. Then there were also made changes in the representation of People's Act, which was reformed. The Citizenship Act is one of them. Then one of the major breakthrough was in order to curb the money power, was income tax filing report of the candidate who is going to fight the elections. So these are the things. Now these were the corrective measures to make the democracy work as Abraham Lincoln has said. So these were the things. Now why I have put forward these measures, the observations, because the rational one is that democracy is based on free debate and open discussion, which Plato has also talked about. But election cannot be complete if there is no free and fair election. There is no freedom of thought and expression, and press has to play an independent role because it is one of the important pillar of the democracy. Now, democracy has to be understood is a system of governance by the people's representative, whether it is elected to the lower house or indirectly in the Rajya Sabha or the upper house. The elected representative should not have a criminal background, because this is one thing which is leading Indian democracy in the wrong direction, and this needs a corrective measure. If the elected representative have a criminal background, then the democracy can lead to the failures. Then I will talk about my rationale too, is that modern welfare state powers are misused for the personal gains and with the vested interest. Now, to check and have a check and balance, Right to Information Act was enacted in 2005. Now, what was this act? This act was that the government is about government offices, peoples who have to take ultimate decision. But what are these decisions for? These are the decisions for the people. And if these decisions are not known to the people on what basis these decisions have been taken place, so these decision cannot, it has to be understood. Now next is administrative reforms which happened in 1996, 1966 to 70, in the form of Lokpal and Lokayukta, which was later on passed in 2013. These were some of the governance perspective to make the democracy work. Now, next is, if I am talking about the democracy, human rights, the woman role is more important, because it is the second, it's not the first or second, it is the another part of the democracy also. The woman has to play an important role in the democracy, especially when we are talking about the rural areas. The violence against a woman in any part of this world is always a threat for the women, for its liberty in the public and private life. And I don't want to create a fear by stating the National Crime Record Bureau of India statistic that every 3 minutes one rape, and every 29 minutes there is a death for dowry, and every 77 minutes there is cruelty against a woman by her husband or relatives. So these are a couple of the horrifying statistics, and this forces us to think that the woman has to be a part and parcel of the representative democracy. Her role is more important. Now, when we talk about the education, the role of a child is also becomes very important, and uh, right to education and the child are interconnected. So, right to education was made compulsory so that the children, the educated, become the educated youth, and they can contribute in the working of the democracy. Now, as we know, the caste system, as we talked about, that when we went in, we got the democracy, caste, creed, religion divisions were there. Indian society was divided on the basis of the caste. So for that, and Hindu society is divided into four varnas, four sections. So in order to eradicate the hello. So Article 17 was enshrined in our constitution so that this untouchability kind of practice and casteism is not being hampering the democracy. Then another thing, the ethnic violence or communal violence which we see in the even the majority rights and minority rights as taking rights seriously. Dworkin has also talked about. And if we see the conflict between black and white in even US also, in order to eradicate that thing, Article 25 to 30 has been enshrined in the fundamental rights, which they can which are the custodian, and Supreme Court of India is custodian of these rights, which talk about the rights to the minorities, religious, cultural and linguistic rights. So uh, in all this my observations, I would say that democracy appears to be of the people, by the people, but not truly for the people until unless which observation which I have talked about, this the objectives, if they are not taken care, whether it is in the form of a women, or whether it is form of a child education, or whether it is in the form of the increasing cost of campaigns, first past post majoritarian rights, or anti-defection law, or impersonation, counting of votes, delimitations of the constitutional boundaries, or hung parliament, we will always be step behind to achieve the democracy form of government which we always see in the developed countries, the Western jurisprudence. So here I end my talk and my observations, and now I am open for the deliberations. Thank you very much to Professor Rina and the University of Batam.
Okay, thank you, Prof. Pankaj. And the moderatory will be continued by me, Ninne Zahara from ASEAN Studies Center of UIB. Is Dr. Manashi Kalita would give some comments after this?
I think because of some health issues, she is logged in, but she is may not be able to present her viewpoints.
Okay, sure, no problem.
She is logged in, but because of the advanced stage of pregnancy, she may not be able to present her views. And roughly, we both of us work together on these slides, so it is her and mine are the same observation, and I apologize on her behalf.
Okay, thank you so much, Prof. Pankaj, and thank you so much, Dr. Manashi Kalita, for your presence in this webinar. We continue to the next panelist of this seminar, which is Dr. Sri Nuryanti from Badan Riset and Inovasi Nasional Indonesia. To Dr. Sri, you may continue to present your presentation.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, my name is Dr. Sri Nuryanti. I'm the Director for Research and Innovations Policy, the Regional Research and Innovations Policy of the Indonesian Research and Innovations Agency, or BRIN. We call it BRIN in Indonesia. And I'm very honored to be invited to come to this webinar. This is my old-fashioned things. I used to be election commissioner of the Republic of Indonesia a long time ago. So we are going to talk about how election and gender issue in Indonesia. Though already the former speaker already mentions on many things, then now I would like to talk on a few things. I will going to talk only a few minutes. The presentation actually explore the interlink between the gender issues and hang on, how could I hang on. Gender issues, election, and also human rights in Indonesia, especially in 2024 election, which was already been done on the 14th of February. That's why we call the Indonesian election like the Valentine election, because it was done during Valentine's Day. Someone said that. So it makes like, a good things, not involving chaotic things. And the significance of the topic, I think if we understand the issue, I think we try to understand how Indonesia promoting democratic values. Also, in terms of gender equality, we also promoting gender equality, and we also talk about human rights that prevented the violations on human rights prevented in this country. If we are talking about gender issues in Indonesia, then we are going to talk about how gender equality status. Despite progress, gender equality remains a significant challenge in Indonesia, with women facing discrimination in various sectors is still happening, But then, unlike the country, I think quite few people have openly challenge the gender equality status. And on women participation in politics, though women are underrepresented in political position because of cultural and structural barriers hindering their participation, we later on we know that women participation is slightly increased. Gender-based violence still happening, though we have many effort already been done to improve our legal protection and support the victims. And on election landscape, we are having different landscape than what Professor Stephen Sherlock has mentioned on Australian election. In Indonesia, election is not compulsory. So this is kind of partly, this is part of our rights to go to cast the ballot in election day. The key political parties and candidates for the 2024 election is seen as there are major parties such as PDIP, Golkar, and Gerindra competing with prominent candidates, including incumbent and new faces. Though we have 18 political parties competing, but this is, can we say that this is the big political party that competing mostly for 2024 election. We have voter participation is high because it shows 83.6% and of voter participation, of voter turnout, with a significant number of young and first-time voters participating in the electoral process. Recent reform aim to improve transparency and fairness, but challenges such as vote buying and electoral violence remain. We know that I also graduated from ANU for my master degree, and some of my friends in ANU, also Indonesia, wrote about how Indonesia the biggest challenge for Indonesian democracy is vote buying. So we can say that in many of our Indonesian election, we still know that wani piro. So how much money you can give me to vote for you, kind of that. Other human rights situation that I would like to mention, we still have various human rights challenges, including freedom of speech restriction, religious intolerance, though it is very slight one, and minority rights violation. Freedom of speech and political expression has been improved. Freedom of speech remain under threat, with the journalists and activists facing harassment. And well, it was a while ago that some of our journalists has been has been accused for harassing political parties or elites. Role of NGO and international organization playing crucial roles in advocating human rights and providing support for effective communities. And in Indonesia, we have a lot of NGOs and also international organizations working together with our local NGO. And other thing that I would like to mention, there is intersection of gender and human rights in election. Gender as sensitive policies, whereas political campaign in Indonesia are increasingly incorporating gender sensitive policies to address women's rights and promote equality. Representations of women and marginalized groups, many efforts are already being made to improve the representations of women and marginalized groups in political platform and decision-making processes. We have some women activist groups that are creating WhatsApp groups in which through WhatsApp group we empowering each other. Impact of gender issues and election outcomes. Well, as I already mentioned a bit, we have gender issues, but we also increase the number of electability of women in election last February. Challenges on opportunity for gender equality. We have cultural norms, economic barriers, and lack of political will pose significant challenges to achieve gender equality in Indonesia. Though many of us, of women activists and also women NGOs concerning of women political participation, for example, trying to do our best play to make a gender equality better in Indonesia, still some barriers still there. Issues such as religious intolerance, discrimination, and limited freedom expression continue to affect human rights, though it is very least one, but still it is also still remain in Indonesian political landscape. And the 2000 election present an opportunity to address this issue through inclusive policies and active civil society engagement. I will going to talk later on how the increasing numbers of elected women we do hope that they could increase our political landscape regarding women and in political landscape. So the final overview of gender on politics, I can say that there is increased female representation. It's seen a significant increase in the number of female candidates and their representation, especially in political campaign. We also have gender sensitive campaign. Political parties are trying hard to adopt gender sensitive approach to address issues such as women's rights, gender equality, and protection against gender-based violence. Though sometimes the gender-sensitive campaigns only on air, only hot during the campaign period. And this time, we do hope for the coming local election, we still see that there will be a gender-sensitive campaign on. And then challenges and progress. Despite progress, we still see challenges remain in achieving full gender parity in politics. But the 2024 election marks an important step forward. And then impact on policy making. The increase of involvement of women in politics is expected to lead to more inclusive and equitable policy making, reflecting the needs of all citizens. This is the features of legislators, the elected women MPs. The left one is the women from Partai Gerindra, and then the middle is the women elected from Golkar political party. And then on the right-hand side is the political party, the women elected from a Democratic Party. So above all, I can say that women electability is at 22.24%. So it increased 1.34%. So now we have 120 of 575 of MPs at national level, or about 20.9% of the 2019 women's elected. Then we can see that PDIP has elected, women elected 27%, 27 women. Golkar has 20 among 102 elected MPs. Gerindra has 19 of 86. Nasdem has 22 of 69. PKB is getting 14 of 68. PKS 9 of 53. PAN 9 of 48. Democrat 9 of 44. And Nasdem performance is at 31.88% of the elected women candidates. So I think this is the features of women electability, though it's only increased 1.34%. But still, we put a great hope for them to make reformation and make a better condition for women and women representation in politics. I think that's all that I would like to present for this time. I'm really thankful to you for inviting me for this event. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Nuryanti, for your presentation. So for now, maybe we can continue to the next session. That is Q&A. Yeah, the question and answer session. I will give chances to the
Dr. Rina Shahrullah.
Oh, is it? Yeah, Dr. Rina is going to give you some questions to the presenter. Please, Dr. Rina.
Okay, thank you so much for all the insights and very wonderful sharing regarding genders, election, and democracy. I have questions for each of the panelists. I start with Pa Stephen. Okay, you're still with us, Pa Stephen? Dr. Stephen Sherlock, still with us? I hope so.
Yes, I am.
Oh, okay, good, Pa Stephen. Okay, so I have a question. It's very interesting to see that Australia actually shifted from rights to elect, and then becomes the mandatory, election, kind of that, which is we're not familiar in Indonesia. So my question is, how is the process to change the mindset, okay, of the Australian? How long does it take, from the people understand that actually election to vote, okay, the candidates is actually the obligations, or it's not merely rights, but they have to do it. And then because it's provided by the act and also governed by the act, and there is the penalty. This is very interesting when we talk about the penalty from the the legal perspective, because the reaction from the people, they say, why is the right becomes mandatory, and why we have to be penalized if we don't go to the to give our voting. Okay, that's the first question, Pa. And the second question, thank you for sharing with us about gender, but I would like to talk about the minority issues. Sorry if it's not really relevant to gender. It's about the Aborigines. Are there representatives of the Aborigines in the parliament? Is it like a special representations, or they have to also go along the process which is conducted under the law of Australia? So that's my question for Pa Stephen. Okay, my question for Dr. Dr. Zahidul is leaving now because he has something to do. And then Prof. Pankaj. Okay. Yes, Prof. Pankaj, are you with us, Prof. Pankaj? Yes. Okay. So my question is, Prof. Pankaj, if that's the election is about the democracy, and you also argue that actually there's a lot of controversial regarding the election in India, and then you also mentioned about the caste problem. Okay, so my question is, would it be possible if, like the people from the Dalit group, the lowest caste of India, okay, and become like the official or the chairmen of the election, how would be the reactions of the people from the high caste? And how is actually the law of India, because it's under the constitution, to remove the caste in India, but then it's still in the social life. And how are you going to link this with the election issues? Because people might be interested if the candidates are from the special caste or certain caste, rather than how to push from the lower caste and then make it as the public figure and then get more voters. That's the first question for Pankaj. And the second question is, would it be possible for India, okay, to eliminate the gender's violence, especially during the election? Because sometimes it becomes the issues, the increasing or the tendency to increase the violence against women, sometimes part of the elections issues in India. Actually, I would like to ask this also to Professor Zahidul, but he's leaving. Okay, my question to Mbak Yanti. Hello, Mbak Yanti. Long time no see. Okay, so Mbak Yanti, my question is, what do you think if, rather than make it election as the rights for the people of Indonesia, the citizens, we try to adopt the notion or the approach of Australia to become a compulsory election? So it's mandated by the law, and then the people, if they don't elect, go to the election ballots, and then they give their votes, and it's going to be the penalty. How would be the reaction for that? That's the first question. And the second, when we see the presentation, the statistic that you show us at the end of your slides, Alhamdulillah, there's an increase the representative of women as a candidate, but still, do you think it's very hard to achieve the law which is mandated 30% or even more, 30% of the representative of women as in the elections, or sitting as the member of the parliament? Okay, because sometimes when the women is actually sitting the parliament, do these women actually fight for gender equality, or they actually going to be the candidate for the election simply because to fill in the requirement of the law? Thank you, Yanti. Okay. Back to you, the moderator. Yes, Pak.
Thank you, Prof. Rina. Do the presenter want to answer the Prof. Rina's question first, or we just continue to the other question?
Could I suggest that we answer the questions now? Otherwise, it'll get too far between questions.
Yes.
Okay, sure. No problem, please.
Okay, if I could address, thank you, Rina, for those very interesting questions. And nice to see you again after a year's separation. The issue of compulsory voting in Australia, how has it persuaded people to vote? Well, how has it persuaded people to accept that system? And the short answer to that really is that the system has been in existence for 100 years. So there is nobody in Australia who can remember any other system. And I think that has been key to the acceptance of it. That I don't know exactly how historically it was people reacted to it back in 1924. So exactly 100 years, it hadn't occurred to me that it's actually the anniversary, how people reacted to it. But for all of my political lifetime, we have a situation where everybody just accepts it's election day and you go and vote. And one of the advantages of that system from the perspective of what it makes governments do, or what it makes the state do, is that it makes it incumbent on the state to make it as easy as possible for people to vote. Because the state is saying you have to vote, therefore it makes it incumbent on the state to facilitate people's capacity to vote. So elections always take place on a Saturday. Electoral polling stations, the place where people go to vote, TPS in Indonesian terms, are always close by. They're small in number. So it's easy for people to vote. So that, I think that's one really important point. And it means that, for example, the unfortunate tendency towards a phenomenon of voter suppression that has occurred in the United States and other countries, it's just impossible for that to happen because the state is actually making people go to vote. So the answer to your question really is that this is, in the case of Australia, it has created a culture of expectation that people will vote. And what is an indication of that is that the actual penalty applied to people who don't vote is quite trivial. It's $20. It's a $20 fine. And it's not the compulsion that actually makes people vote. It's the culture around it which has developed. And what happens if somebody does not vote is that they receive a letter from the AEC saying, you have voted, can you provide a reasonable excuse for why you didn't vote? If a person can say, well, I broke my leg in the morning and then blah, 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 some acceptable reason, then they are not fined. And thousands of those letters go out after every election. And there are some people who just say, oh, I don't have an excuse, and they just pay the $20 fine. But that's a very, very small number. Basically, the system works because it's been in operation for a long time. The second question is about Indigenous Australians. Now, there is not a quota of seats for Indigenous people in Australia. One of the reasons why that wouldn't be possible in Australia is that you have what is actually a ridiculously small parliament, only 155 members in the House of Representatives. It's far too small. There are constitutional reasons why that is the case, but it doesn't really leave space for representation. But that's not really what people say. That's just the reality if you look at it objectively. And there never really has been serious pressure from Indigenous people for there to be some form of reserved seats. What has happened progressively, especially in the last 20 years or so, is the increasing number of Indigenous people who are being elected. It's still a small minority, but then the Indigenous population is a very small minority as well. It's less than 3% of the population. And really that's come about because Indigenous candidates have been encouraged and fostered by each of the major parties, especially by the Labor Party. So there is a slowly increasing number of Indigenous members of the national parliament, but especially at the state and territory level, in particular in the Northern Territory of Australia, where half the population is Indigenous, with a high concentration of Indigenous population. There is a large number of Indigenous members of parliament, which reflect the fact that the Indigenous population is small. So historically, Indigenous people have been terribly underrepresented, but that picture is gradually changing, but it's changing through the processes really of the party system, that parties more and more are willing to put forward Indigenous candidates.
Thank you so much, Pak Stephen.
Thank you so much. Okay.
So, Professor Rina, can I answer? Professor Rina, can I answer the question?
Yes, please, Prof. Pankaj.
Okay, so the first question which was being asked to me was, what about the representation of the people of the caste suppressed people? So what the election reforms have been done in India is that they have reserved some of the seats for the representatives of these people, so that they can have a say in the participative direct democracy. And they are with like last 20-30 years, they have now representation in the politics. And after their representation, and especially the people from the higher caste have accepted this truth gradually, and it has led to the development for people of different backgrounds. And the governance perspective, what are the policies and the fundings which are for the development of the poor people of these backgrounds, they have got the say in the resource allocation and the sharing of the resources. So this is one aspect. Now second is as far as the question rises of women related participation, and the women seats are also being reserved for the people from the women from certain areas. And this has increased the women participation in the democracy, whether it is the grassroots level representation in the rural areas or urban areas in the municipalities or panchayats. They have also increased, and this has these figures have really helped the participative democracy. So this is all I have to say. Is there any other thing which I have to
Okay,
any
thank you so much, Prof. Pankaj.
so
Thank you, Prof. Pankaj. Now continue to Dr. Nuryanti.
Okay. Well, for the first question, is that any possibility for Indonesia to make the voting compulsory? I think this is part of how we could relate to the Indonesian history. Up to nowadays, though it is under a new order period, the voter turnout is more than 70. And although during under new order period, it was how to say, kind of being asked massively asked by the government. And these days it is freely actually it is asked by the election, the regulation, and also by political party. But since we know that the voter turnout is more than 50, we still I'm sure that we still going to have election as part of our rights, not as part of the compulsory system. In Australia, I think this is also related to back in the history in 2026 or something that Professor Sherlock mentioned earlier, that the voter turnout is less than 30, I guess. So in that case, why Australia becoming compulsory, having compulsory system, because the voter turnout is very less than 30. And then in Indonesia, we still see that in each election, we have more than 50%. And then this year, we have 83.6%. So I think we're still going to have the election as part of our political rights rather than as a compulsory system. Yeah. And on the 30% quota, well, in Indonesia, the 30% quota for women is still part of affirmative action. So we are trying to, I mean, the democracy activists trying to influence political party and also trying to involve to influence MPs on the decision that been made to increase the number of women candidates from political party, but then as can we see that only less than 30% of women elected. Only Nasdem who has 31%, and this is part of how our some of our NGO and also some of our concerned activists, women activists, are trying to put our best effort to make the percentage of elected women higher from time to time, from each election to other election. That's part of our homework, how to increase the electability of women in the election. But still, we, as I already mentioned, that we still have some barriers on how women could participate in election. I used to have research done in quite many part of Indonesia. And they said, when I interview women candidate, they said that, oh, I have to ask permission from my husband. One other factor is, I will be defeated by men candidates because I don't have, how to say, capital. I don't have money to compete with them. Some of them also say that I will have to put my CV at on as the candidate at least, though I'm not, I will not be elected because I don't have access to politics, and I don't have money to influence people to vote for me. But this is a really good, good effort that has been done by many of us to increase to women to make themselves as candidate for last election. Yeah, back to you, Mbak.
Yeah. Thank you, Mbak Sri, Mbak Yanti.
Could I just add a little bit on this issue of compulsory voting in Australia?
Yes, please.
With your permission. Now, if I gave the impression that before compulsory voting, Australia's participation rate was below 30%, that's certainly not the impression I wanted to create, because that was certainly not the case. It was far, far higher than that. So it wasn't because of a terrible problem of such a low participation.
Oh, yeah.
I'm glad to hear that.
Okay.
But one just quick observation is that personally, I would think that it's probably not necessary to think about compulsory voting in Indonesia, because the participation rate is actually extraordinarily high.
Yeah.
Of voluntary voting, 83% is particularly good.
Yeah.
And you could probably only achieve actually another 10% on that with compulsory voting. But one other quick observation too is that simultaneous elections, presidential and DPR elections, have had the effect of increasing participation rates. Because fewer people participated in the DPR elections, the parliamentary elections, when they were separate. But because everybody votes now on the same day, that has had the effect of increasing participation rates.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you to the panelists for your answer, and Dr. Rina for your questions. We have 3 other questions in the meeting and in the chat box. First is to Dr. Stephen Sherlock from Nadaro Indra. That question is, how would you assess the recently concluded elections in Indonesia last February? And what are your views on the changes in voter behavior observed in the last election? That's a question to Dr. Stephen Sherlock. Do you mind to answer it?
Yes, certainly. It's a very, very big question. There are many, many things that I could say in response to that. One observation that I would make of the many, many I could make is to observe the fact that if you're talking about voter behavior, that it's becoming more and more clear that voter behaviour in the presidential election is becoming quite different from voter behaviour in the parliamentary elections. And what I mean by that is that where voter behaviour in presidential elections tends to be very volatile and, of course, focused on individuals, the results in the parliamentary election over the last 4 elections have been remarkably similar. That if you look at the votes obtained by the top 9 parties since the 2014 or even 2009 elections up until now, the percentage of votes going to each party is very, very similar. There's been very, very little change. The PDIP generally has been the winning party, Golkar next, and then in recent elections, Gerindra. And each of the other smaller parties have been winning pretty much the same vote as they have been. Now, what that does, of course, is it's evidence against this idea that it's a very common idea in Indonesian politics called the coattail effect. All of my Indonesian friends would be very much aware, of course, of that. The coattail effect being the idea that people who vote for the party, people who vote for a particular presidential party or particular presidential candidate in the presidential election will therefore go and vote for the president's party in the parliamentary election. This is the idea of the coattail effect, that the parliamentary party hangs on to the coattails of the presidential candidate. But in fact, except for the one case in the 2004 election where SPY won his Democrat Party won a very large percentage of the vote, in every other election that has not been the case. In the last election, even though Prabowo, as the leader of Gerindra, won the election as president in a landslide, his party increased only by about, I think, 1.5% from the previous election. So it's showing that people's loyalty to political parties in the parliamentary sphere is quite different to the way in which they are voting for individual presidential candidates. And that's a very, very interesting phenomenon, because many political scientists make the case that Indonesian political parties are not different from each other in policy terms, which is a point it's only half true. They argue that people are being swayed by money politics. People are voting according to who they're paid by. But all of that doesn't seem to be borne out by the fact that people are generally voting for the same party in each of the presidential elections. So I think that's a very, very interesting phenomenon that's been once again confirmed in the 2024 election.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Stephen Sherlock. And I think the other question is to Dr. Zahidul Islam. Meanwhile, he's not here, so we can continue to the next questions first. And we keep the questions to Dr. Zahidul later. And the last question is it is also the last question in this session. For the panelists from India, this is the question from Dr. Surya Anuraga from Universitas Muhammadiyah Malang. For the panelists from India, Australia, and Bangladesh, okay, what percentage of women are members of parliament or in the legislature, and are there any rules regarding women's involvement in parliament or the legislature? Thank you. Dr. Surya Anuraga, thank you for the question. And so the questions may be sent to Dr. Stephen Sherlock and Prof. Pankaj. Are you here? Dr. Stephen, do you mind to answer this?
Yes, certainly. Today in Australia, the number of women in total in Parliament is approaching 50% if you take both houses together. But there are more women in the upper house, where the proportional representation system tends to be more advantageous to women than it is in the lower house. That's a positive way of looking at it. A negative way of looking at it would say, well, the House of Representatives is a more powerful chamber, and there are more men in the more powerful chamber than there are in the less powerful upper house. That's a negative way of looking at it. But the big difference is along party lines, is that the Labor Party has a much higher number of women representatives than the Conservative parties do. Now, the Labor Party in total in the two houses has more women than men representatives. As far as the second part of that question goes, are there any statutory, any legislative requirements about women's participation or women's candidacy? No, there are not. There are no legislative requirements. The key difference is that the Labor Party has its own voluntary internal party mechanism aimed at achieving women's representation. And as I mentioned in my presentation, that's been in operation since the 1990s, at a time when the Labor Party had a fairly low women's representation. That system has gradually worked to create the situation today where more than 50% of the women in the Labor Party representation are women.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Stephen Sherlock. Maybe that question is going to be our closing questions to this webinar of human rights and the election issues. So thank you for all of the presenter. Now we're moving on to the closing statement from Dr. Rina Shahrullah. To Dr. Rina, the screen is yours.
Okay. First of all, I'd like to thank Dr. Stephen Sherlock, Dr. Zahidul Islam, Dr. Pankaj, and Dr. Nuryanti, Mbak Sri. Okay, thank you so much. It's like a reunion for me to see you, all of you, online. Okay, I would like to mention that this webinar is initiated by the alumni of Salzburg Global Seminar, which Mbak Yanti also part of it long time ago, Mbak Yanti, when we were invited by the Nippon Foundation to participate to discuss about the Middle East issues, Arab Spring at that time.
North African.
Yes, yes. Okay. And then also every month we organize different topics and different issues regarding human rights and gender. And we would like to ask all the participants who would like to join either as a participants or as a speakers, or any colleagues that you would like to recommend us to talk about different issues. Inshallah, we plan to talk about Palestinian and Israeli conflict next month, but it's based on the how many panelists are going to involve. We would like to spread not only in Asia, Australia, but we would like to see also from the response from our colleagues from North Africa, and also from US, from Europe, and also from the Middle East regarding these particular issues. But of course, there are other issues that we would like to tackle regarding human rights and gender. So thank you very much to all the panelists and also to Ibu Ninne from ASEAN Studies Center, okay, and then other friends who are helping us in managing this webinar. Thank you very much, and we hope to see you in person someday. Please come to Batam. If you happen to be in Batam, please contact us at Universitas International Batam. Thank you so much. Okay.